Hello world and welcome to Web Dev Frontiers. My name is Tomasz and I'm here to share my experience with you in web tech. In today's video, I'm going to take a look at two ways to fetch data using React applications. And if you stay long enough till the end of the video, I'm going to show you a way to make sure that your fetch requests get cancelled when necessary, which is a very important technique to implement in certain types of React applications. If you're ready, let's go and write some React code together. I have already set up a very basic React application using Vite, and I've modified the React application so that I only display a hello world message. And this is going to be our starting point. Now, the first type of data fetch that I would like to show you in React is going to be based on a user interaction. So for example, what if there's a button and then we would like to fetch some data once the user has pressed that button. So we're going to be implementing that together right now. So as opposed to saying ciao mondo, we're going to be replacing this with Star Wars characters. And immediately I'm going to be adding a button under here. And the button itself is going to have an onClick handler. And inside that onClick handler, we're going to be making the request for the data. So we do have the button added, and let's now add the getCharacters function. So this is going to be an asynchronous function that we're going to be calling. And the reason why it's going to be an asynchronous function is because we would like to use the fetch API to make a request, and the fetch API supports promises. And I would like to use the async await keyword in here. So let's create a response and let's call await fetch, and then let's go out to a particular REST API endpoint. And let's add an endpoint, and I'm going to be using Swappy, which is the Star Wars API. It's a free and fun little API that returns information about various bits and pieces of people, planets, and other things about the Star Wars universe. So that is going to be swappy.dev/API/people. So this is going to return us a list of Star Wars characters. Then I would like to have access to the data, and I'm going to call await response.json. So basically we get the response back in a JSON format. And now what we need to do, of course, is make sure that this data is available in the UI. So in order to do that, we need to essentially create a state inside this app component. So I'm just going to create the state. I'm going to call this character and set character. Make that equal to useState, and I'm just going to set that state to initialize as an empty array. And once we have the data inside this getCharacters asynchronous function, I'm going to call setCharacter, and we're just going to do data.results, because we have a results property that comes back from the API and we would like to use that. All right, so now underneath the button, what I'm going to do is iterate through the characters and display the individual character by using the JavaScript map method. Okay, so we've added the map method. Actually, this is going to be character, and let's call this, characters, and let's call this set characters as well, and make that update right here as well. Okay, and the last thing that we need to do before we actually run this example is, of course, to import useState from React. Now, I've already added some default styles. So we get Star Wars characters as a header. We have a button here, and if we click this button, hopefully in a couple of seconds, we are going to be seeing a list of Star Wars characters. And there you have it. Here it is. Now, the only problem with this solution, even though it works, is that I could click the show me button a number of times. So if I make this large screen, and if I bring up my DevTools with the network panel open, you will see that when I click the show me button, it makes an API request. But if I click the show me button 5 or 6 times, we're going to make 5 or 6 requests. And that's not really ideal, because we don't want people to keep on clicking on the button. We want them to wait for the response. So it's absolutely critical that when you have a very simple application like this, where you make an API call, that you constantly provide feedback to your users and you don't allow them to click a particular button. So let's now actually go ahead and implement this change. So let's go back to the editor. And what we're going to do is essentially make sure that the button is going to be disabled and that we add a loading screen indicating that the data load is actually ongoing. Okay, so let's add another state and let's call that loading and then set loading to make sure that we have a state, we have a way to actually track this, and let's set this to be false. Okay, so when this particular getCharacters function gets called first, we're going to set the load to be true, or the loader to be true, and when it's done and when we've actually received the data and we have set the data there, we're going to call setLoading again and set it back to false. Okay, then we're going to add a disabled attribute to the button, and we're going to take the value of the loading variable. And last but not least, where should we paste that? Maybe let's add it under the button. We're going to say, if loading is true, then display a paragraph that just states loading. Okay, so let's hit save and let's see how the experience is going to be different inside the browser. So if I now click the button, notice I have a loading indicator and I can't click the button again. So let's do this again. So refresh the page, click, we get loading, and then we get the characters. So there's constant feedback to the user indicating that something is happening. Now, the one thing that I haven't done here, which I highly recommend that you do as well, is that you wrap this fetch API call in a try catch block. And I'll let you do this as an exercise. So you should do this in a try block. I'm not going to type it up for you. This should be in a catch block, and make sure that if there's an error, you set the loading indicator again to be false, because in case of an error, you want to re-enable the button, but you should also display some sort of an error message inside the UI. Okay, but I'll let you write up the code. You have the boilerplate right here on my screen, so it should be very easy, but please do this as a sort of homework. Our next example is going to be a little bit more elaborate, because instead of making the request based on a user interaction, we're going to be making the fetch API request when the particular page loads, or rather when a particular component is going to load. And to achieve that, we're going to be using the useFact React hook. Now, useFact, for those of you who are not familiar with, I think the easiest way to think of it is to think about a way that allows React to monitor something, and then if the value of that something changes, run something that's inside the useFact. It's almost like an after effect of something. So for example, if the value of an ID changes, whatever you've defined inside the useFact block should be executed by React. And so React can monitor particular values for changes, and then based on those changes can execute code. Now, in this particular example, I'm going to create yet another component. And just to keep things simple, I'm going to create that other component inside the same app.jsx file. Now, of course, when you develop a much larger React application, you wouldn't be doing this. You would create a component as a separate standalone file. But as I said, just to keep things simple and focus on what matters, which is the fetch API request, I'm going to be adding the component in line here. And that component is going to be called the character component. So essentially, the component is going to be responsible for displaying information about the Star Wars characters. Okay, so this is going to print some text in our case. So let's go ahead and implement that. So I'm going to create the character component, and I would like to extract a prop called the ID, meaning that this particular component is going to be receiving an ID prop. And then inside the component, I would like to have two states. So I'm going to be setting a character and then a method to set the value of that character variable. And we're going to be using useState for this one. And I'm also going to have a loading indicator, just how we had it before. And I'm just going to set this to be true as its default value. Okay, and then what we're going to do, of course, we're going to have a return JSX here. So that's going to be the essentially the HTML that this component produces. And we're just going to keep it simple. In fact, I'm not even going to put the parentheses. I'm just going to say, if there's a character, then just display a particular paragraph that says something like, hello there, I am, and then just print out information about the character. So say character.name. So we're just going to print out the name of the character. Now, there's a lot more that we need to code up here, because first of all, we need to make the API request. Now, as I said, this particular character component is going to receive an actual ID. So whenever we're going to call it from our app component, we're going to say character, and we need to pass it an ID. So for example, 1, okay, or whatever else. Now, once we get that ID, we can use that to actually query for information about the character itself. And of course, we need to enable that logic here inside the character component. And as I said, we're going to be using the useEffect hook. Okay, so I have useEffect here, which accepts a callback function. And now we're going to edit that callback function. Now remember what I said. Whatever we put here inside useEffect, the bit that I'm highlighting now, is code that gets executed based on whether the fact something has changed in React. And we can tell React what values to monitor. Now, what we would like to do, of course, is add an actual array, and we're just going to be monitoring the ID. So in other words, if the ID prop changes or its value changes, then I would like to run whatever code I put inside useEffect. And what I'm going to put inside useEffect is going to be the data fetching. Okay, so this is going to be an actual asynchronous function that we're going to put in here. And the very first thing that we're going to do is set loading to be true again, just in case, because we're going to set that to false at a later point in time. And then we're going to say async function, and we can call this get data. We can call it whatever we want really. And inside this asynchronous function, I'm going to have a try catch finally block. Okay, so we're going to implement this now. So the very first thing that I want to do is, of course, make an API request. So I'm going to say const response, await, fetch, and then we're going to use the same Star Wars API, except we're going to go to swappy.dev/API/people/ and then just use the ID, which comes in as a prop. And I can tell you ID number 1 is going to be Luke Skywalker. So if we run this first, the text that we're going to get here is going to say, hello there, I'm Luke Skywalker. Okay, so we of course need to make sure that we have the data as well. So we can say await response.json, so just make sure that we transform the data that comes back from the API to a JSON format. And last but not least, we're going to call set character, and we're going to set the data that we have back to the state. Okay. Now, if there's an error, then of course we're going to do something like console.error and just print out the error. And then finally, and this may be a new syntax for you, but you can have a try catch finally block. So basically, once the try is completed, if there are no errors, then we can have a finally block. And in this case, we're just going to say set loading to be false, because at this point, we now have the data ready. Okay. And then because we just wrote the function itself, we need to make sure that we call this function right here. Okay, so that should be really it. And of course, what we need to do as well, we're not yet using the loading variable here, our Boolean. So let's add a block here as well, which just says if loading, then we're going to be returning something like h2 loading. Okay, and as you can see, as I save this, this is now displaying loading, and once that's done, it is now displaying, hello there, I am Luke Skywalker indeed. So let's actually make this an H2 as well, so that the text is a little bit more prominent. So why is this already working? Well, because we already added the character component here with an ID of 1. But now, what is that I would like to show you here? So let's assume that you have a button somewhere on the UI that will allow you to make requests for additional characters. Now you can see the solution works at the moment because we made the API call when the component loads. However, there's going to be something very important to note here, because there's a very serious problem. I don't want to call it a bug, but the problem can manifest because we're not doing something correctly here. And I'm going to show that to you right now. So imagine that you have a button here as well, which is going to allow you to make a particular request every time when you click it for a new character. Okay, so what I'm going to do, in fact, we're going to have another state here. I'm just going to call that ID set ID, and we're going to use state, and I'm going to be using 1 as the default state. And for the character, I'm also going to be referencing that. So I'm just going to call ID here. And on the onClick event handler for the button, I'm going to be setting a random value for the ID every time when the button is going to be clicked. And we're going to call set ID here, and we're going to call math.floor with math.random times 10 and plus 1. And actually, I just noticed that I made a small mistake here. So this should be a callback for set ID like this. And there we go. So we get the UI back. We now get the load character button. And if I click that, then we get the loading indicator again. And hopefully a new character will show up. Hello there, I'm Owen Lost. So at this point, you're thinking, well, this works. What is the problem? Well, let's go full screen again. Let's open DevTools, go into the network panel, and let's clear everything. And let me show you the error. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click this button maybe 5 or 6 times again. So you can see 5 or 6 requests go out, and then I get the response as they come in. And so the UI keeps on flashing. And so you see the issue here is that when I make an API call followed by another one, followed by another one, I'm not canceling the previous requests. All the requests go through, and that's why we get this weird behavior where the first request comes in, the second, the third, the fourth, and that's why the UI keeps on updating with, and then whatever the latest request is that comes in, that's going to update the UI, and that's going to be the final one. And providing this to your end users would be a very bad experience, and you should not be doing that. So let's see how we can actually fix this particular behavior. Now, you may have heard of the abort controller inside JavaScript, and the good news is we can use that inside React as well. So all we need to do is come back to our async get data function, and we need to look at how we use the fetch API in here. And we need to implement the abort controller. And this is going to be done in 3 steps. So first, I'm going to create a variable called abort controller, where I'm going to create a new instance of the abort controller, like so. Once I do that, I can actually pass a options object to the fetch API, and I can set a signal, and I can utilize the abort controller as a signal for the fetch API. So I'm going to say abort controller dot signal. And then last but not least, inside the use effect, we can have a so-called cleanup function. So what happens after the use effect callback runs? So we can have a return inside this callback, and inside this return, we can execute a function, we can do whatever else we want. And this is what React refers to as a cleanup. So inside of this cleanup, what I want to do is essentially I want to make sure that the abort controller is going to be aborting the requests. So all I need to do now is actually return a function here, which is going to call abort controller, and then we need to call the abort method. Okay, and we will see that the behavior of the application is going to be significantly different than before. So I'm going to go full screen again, go open up the network panel, just refresh the page for good measure. Make sure that the requests are actually cleared. And I'm going to click the button again a couple of times, but notice the behavior is going to be significantly different. So you see, I clicked it 4 or 5 times. All the previous requests were automatically canceled. And it says here on the status, it says canceled. And then whatever the last one was, that is the only request that has gone through, which is a very different behavior than what we had before. And this makes sense in multiple use cases in React. You can think of this as maybe you have an application that is a single page application with multiple routes. Inside one route, you make a fetch API request, then your user navigates away to another route, but the fetch API request is still going to be running behind the scenes. So you have to make sure that you have something in place that stops the fetch API requests from happening. And the way to do that, and the easiest way to do that, in my opinion, inside React, is to use the abort controller and to use the abort controller signal in conjunction with the fetch API. And there you have it. These are the 2 ways that you can make fetch API requests for data inside React, while making sure that there are no additional requests going in and that you have only one request because you have used the abort controller. If you have used the abort controller, or you have very specific use cases or interesting projects, please add them in the comment section below. If you liked the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. And of course, for more such content, please subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.